It's no secret that Russia is desperate to capture the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. It's been trying to take control of this place for over a year already, launching one attack after another, using every trick in the book to break through Ukraine's defensive lines and finally exert some sort of control. Time and time again, its forces have been defeated, and the latest defeat might just be the biggest one yet for Vladimir Putin and his war machine, because this time Ukraine didn't simply fend off Russian attacks. Instead, it wiped out literally thousands of enemy soldiers, as well as huge numbers of tanks and equipment too, leaving the Kremlin's commanders scratching their heads and wondering where on earth they go from here. It wasn't supposed to work out this way. This time was supposed to be different, as Pokrovsk was one of Russia's top targets as part of its grand summer offensive campaign. No longer willing to suffer delays and setbacks, the Kremlin made the decision several months ago to throw everything it had at the city. It's easy to see why. Pokrovsk is a major industrial, logistical and transport hub. It sits in a highly strategic location, has several large highways encircling the city and extending in all directions across Ukraine, and it has a major railway line coming through it. This city is obviously invaluable for whichever side controls it. It's nicknamed the Gateway to Donetsk, and numerous Ukrainian supply lines feed the city from deeper into the country. Many of those supplies also pass through Pokrovsk on their way to other important locations elsewhere along the front lines, providing Ukraine soldiers with food, water, ammunition, fuel and reinforcements. For Ukraine, Pokrovsk is an anchor, a stable solid base from which to operate. For Russia, it represents a path forward deeper into Donetsk and closer to Kyiv and other significant Ukrainian cities and towns. That's why both sides have battled so hard over this single location, and it's why, back in June, Russia amassed a gigantic force, estimated at around 110,000 troops in the Pokrovsk sector. From that point on, Pokrovsk became the hottest spot along the entire front line, and with Ukrainian manpower slowly but surely starting to dwindle, many analysts expected that the city would at last fall to the Russians. On paper, that's surely what should have happened. But on paper, Russia should have won this war a long time ago, since it had such a significantly larger force, more advanced military equipment, and far greater stocks of armor, missiles, bombs and other weapons compared to its opponent when it first launched the invasion. In this war, things rarely work out the way they would on paper. Instead, Ukraine continues to defy the odds and astonish the world, while Russia continues to flail and flounder when the going gets tough, and that's exactly what happened here. Russia built up a force it thought would be big enough and tough enough to take Pokrovsk. It had tens of thousands of men ready to roll out against a significantly smaller number of Ukrainian defenders, and the summer offensive was set to follow a tight, precise schedule. First, Russian forces would capture Pokrovsk. From there, generals planned to make movements towards the northeast in order to flank the famous fortress belt, where several additional Ukrainian strongholds are still under Kyiv's control, like Sloviansk and Kostiantynivka. According to reports, Kremlin commanders promised ruthless execution and rapid results. But things didn't go to plan at all. Instead, the Russian army has failed to achieve a single one of its main strategic objectives over the course of the summer offensive, especially in and around the city of Pokrovsk. Despite trying everything they could think of, including sending soldiers into the city disguised as civilians, launching repeat assaults involving small mobile squads, and even using artillery and other weapons to bombard the area, all that the Kremlin's commanders have managed to capture are a few forgotten farming fields, isolated settlements strewn with rubble and wreckage, and desolate tree lines. Pokrovsk itself remains in Ukraine's hands. The city's steadfast guardians continue to do an astonishing job of holding their ground, even in the face of overwhelming odds and extraordinary adversity. There are several reasons why Moscow's summer offensive failed so spectacularly in this direction. The first and perhaps biggest issue was the lack of armor. This was the first time in the war so far that Moscow was seen launching a major summer offensive with almost no tank reserves. A few tanks were still spotted here and there, often sporting ludicrous armor add-ons like coils of barbed wire and makeshift spikes in order to withstand kamikaze drone strikes, but on the whole, Russian forces had to make do with much simpler and far less resilient vehicles, including motorcycles, jeeps, and even golf carts. The reason for this is simple. While Russia began the war with one of the biggest tank stocks in the world, those numbers soon started to dwindle as Ukrainians used mines, drones, missiles and more to take them out. As the war progressed and Russia's commanders continued to be increasingly wasteful with their armor, the total number of damaged and destroyed vehicles eventually became too high to handle. Thus, the Kremlin resorted to desperate measures. First, it dragged rusty relics of Soviet tanks out of storage facilities, but soon saw that decades-old tanks, designed for a possible Cold War conflict, weren't of much use in a 21st century war with a highly innovative and adaptable opponent. So, not long after that, Russia decided to simply stop using tanks altogether in most areas along the front lines, even in Pokrovsk, since it simply couldn't find any effective ways to keep them intact long enough to deal meaningful damage to its enemy. The trouble is that without armor to support them, ground troops are significantly weaker, even in large numbers. So, despite amassing a force of intimidating size in Pokrovsk, Russia failed to make much of a dent in the Ukrainian lines since its soldiers and their simple civilian vehicles were repeatedly picked off by Ukraine's drone operators. Often, the drones flew deep behind the front lines, up to 15.5 miles into enemy territory, scanning the surroundings for any signs of life before homing in and wiping out whatever targets they found. Thanks to this, large parts of Russia's force were destroyed before they even got close to Pokrovsk, and those left behind had little means of defending themselves against the never-ending swarms of drones buzzing in the skies overhead. The second big reason why the Russian offensive in Pokrovsk has so far failed to bear fruit is that Ukraine was also spending this summer launching numerous precision deep strikes on high-value Russian locations and important assets. With the aid of weapons like long-range drones, high-mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS, and missiles, Ukrainian soldiers struck Russia where it hurt the most, wiping out core pieces of infrastructure and vital supplies to fuel the Kremlin's war machine, including supply depots, fuel convoys, and command posts. The impact of these strikes all add up, and every single time Ukraine blows up an ammunition depot or fuel truck, it delays and disrupts Russia's plans. All of a sudden, the Kremlin's commanders are forced back to the drawing board, having to come up with new strategies, schedules, and solutions for the countless new problems Ukraine sends their way. This is such a critical element of Ukraine's entire strategy in the war. So often, Kyiv's forces focus on identifying assets and infrastructure that matter the most to Russia. They bide their time, make their plans, and wait for just the right moment to launch their attacks, opting for precision, intelligence, and care, a direct contrast to the reckless, wasteful, and unsustainable actions of their opponents. As a result, Russia has lost an incalculable quantity of assets this year alone, all blown to bits by Ukraine's drones, missiles, and rockets. They've lost ammunition that could have been sent to the soldiers marching on Pokrovsk, vehicles and armors that might have been used to overwhelm the city's defenses, artillery shells and other weapons that could have dented the Ukrainian lines of control, and other supplies that could have proven to be invaluable in the ongoing fight for this all-important industrial city. And this leads on to the third reason why Russian soldiers have so far been unable to hoist their flag above the city of Pokrovsk: tactics. The contrasting tactics of the two armies are one of the most fascinating stories of the war so far. On the other side, as previously mentioned, Ukraine has become synonymous with strategic planning and careful use of its resources. From the outset of the invasion, Kyiv has understood its place and position in the war. It knew from day one that it had a far smaller force, fewer resources, and little chance of victory in any sort of direct clash with its opponent. Ukraine quickly realized that if it wanted to win this war, or at least survive long enough for some sort of ceasefire or peace agreement to be achieved, it had to be smart. It had to use the few advantages it had, leaning on its many allies across the Western world for support and using its home field advantage. It couldn't commit the same numbers of troops and resources that Russia could, so it couldn't possibly fight for every single square mile of frontline terrain. Instead, it had to pick and choose its battles, identify the locations that mattered the most, and do whatever it took to defend them. Evidently, it didn't take long for Ukrainian forces to see that Pokrovsk was one of the most valuable locations it needed to keep control of. Nearby settlements and smaller towns and villages in the area didn't necessarily matter as much, as long as Pokrovsk stayed in Kyiv's control. So, rather than spreading itself too thin and attempting to keep hold of every single sliver of land, Ukraine effectively allowed Russia to take some of the less meaningful pieces of land here and there, all while cementing its defenders in places like Pokrovsk, so that when the time came, they'd be ready to hold their ground. On the other side, there's Russia, which has pursued a completely different tactical plan since the war began. Confident in the massive size of its army, the seemingly endless number of new recruits it can call up each month, and the vast stocks of tanks, armor, and munitions it began the invasion with, Russia has followed a brute force strategy throughout this war. It's repeatedly attempted to overwhelm its opposition up and down the front lines, throwing massive amounts of men and weapons at even the smallest of settlements and slimmest slivers of territory. It's refused to settle for anything less than complete conquest of Ukrainian territories, no matter the cost. And speaking of cost, the Kremlin's commanders have been embarrassingly wasteful with their resources, especially the soldiers under their command. On countless occasions, those in charge have treated troops as cannon fodder, throwing multitudes of men to their deaths, knowing that more will be along to replace them a week or two later. And because of that, Russia has suffered tremendous losses, with shocking numbers of soldiers killed or wounded for only the most minor of territorial gains. People have lost their lives or been sent home with life-changing injuries just for the odd patch of dirt or crater-filled field, and one recent analytical report in The Economist suggested that Russia may have anywhere from 984,000 to 1,438,000 casualties in total, with up to 480,000 soldiers dead. Ukraine has, of course, suffered tragic losses of its own, but the overall estimated casualty numbers are dramatically less than those of the Russians. The Economist report noted that, at the lower end of the estimate, Ukraine has suffered around 77,000 deaths, with a further 77,800 missing in action. Even if the true number is much higher than that, best estimates suggest that there are around 5 Russian soldier deaths for every single Ukrainian fatality. And that statistic is perhaps the most powerful example of the different tactical approaches of the two sides. The Russians, with their wasteful plans and complete disregard for human life, have allowed jaw-dropping amounts of their own soldiers to perish, with Vladimir Putin callously justifying every death earlier this year when he said that they were all for a cause. These are the people who created the conditions for those now in the ranks to move forward. In this sense, we do not have a single loss that was in vain. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, can't save everyone, but have certainly not been as reckless and negligent with their people and their resources as the Russians. Kyiv's commanders have done what they can to keep losses to a minimum wherever possible, not shying away from ordering tactical retreats when necessary to keep troops alive, and trying to plan every move with care and consideration. At least in the Pokrovsk sector, it's the Ukrainian strategy that's repeatedly won the day. Even when Russia managed to make a minor breakthrough during the latter part of the summer, with Kremlin forces advancing towards the city of Donbas, it all ended in disaster once again. At the time, it appeared that Russia might at long last have the upper hand. Heavy clashes broke out in various points along the front line, and Russian troops appeared to be advancing around Pokrovsk, with some news agencies at the time predicting that vital Ukrainian supply lines to the city were close to being cut, and it was only a matter of time before the Kremlin's forces moved in for the kill. After all, Russia not only had the manpower advantage, but also now seemed to have a strategic edge in terms of territorial control as well. This all came at a critical time in the war as well, only days before the much publicized Alaska meeting between Putin and US President Donald Trump. It appeared that Putin had ordered a massive push on Pokrovsk in the hopes of capturing the city and proving to Trump that Russia was in the ascendancy and on the march to victory. Unfortunately for him, the whole plan went up in smoke. No sooner had it started than Russia's big Donbas offensive collapsed. Ukraine soon announced that it had recaptured many of the small villages that Russia had previously taken control of in the area, and groups of Russian troops were cut off from their supply lines and reinforcements before being either wiped out or captured by their opponents. Before August was out, Russia's gains in the region were undone, and their troops were once more pushed back. In September, Putin became even more desperate as reports emerged of Russia stooping to gruesome new lows. According to an article in The Telegraph, Russia started sending units made up of soldiers with chronic illnesses like HIV and hepatitis into battle around Pokrovsk. These soldiers were marked with special armbands to separate them from their healthy peers, with former British Army Colonel and chemical weapons expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon stating that this was a clear sign of President Putin's desperation to capture the city once and for all. There's nothing off limits. Putin is determined to keep fighting this way. I think he's always believed that if he can just outlast Ukraine and its allies, he'll ultimately prevail. Throwing people into the meat grinder is part of that strategy, and Pokrovsk is the meat grinder. The expert went on to summarize the grim situation facing the Kremlin's army. Right now, the Russian army is hemorrhaging not just blood but capability. Poor health, poor planning, and poor preparation are proving as deadly as any Western supplied weapon. and it doesn't appear that Russia's prospects are going to get any brighter anytime soon. As of right now, Ukrainian troops are said to be carrying out a clearing operation all across the Dobropilya sector, focusing specifically in the Volodymyrivka area. There, Russia recently made the decision to deploy some elements of its remaining armor, launching a series of mechanized assaults towards Ukraine's defensive lines. Yet again, these assaults failed, and the area basically became a big graveyard, littered with the bodies of fallen Russian troops and the charred smoking remains of blown-up vehicles. Ukrainian infantry units are on the prowl in this part of Donetsk, ably supported by reconnaissance and FPV drones in the air, scanning the ground for any remaining signs of life, tracking down the few Russian soldiers that are still in the area, with some hiding out in bushes and basements and others fleeing on foot. Unfortunately, many of those Russians who are still physically able to walk or run are heading the wrong way. Groups have been seen heading not east towards their own supply post and defensive positions, but west, deeper into the region, towards places like Nikhanorivka, where more Russian troops have been completely encircled and isolated, just waiting to be picked off by Ukrainian infantrymen. In short, Russian forces in this sector are operating in a state of mindless panic, running from one danger zone into another. Low on ammunition, food and other supplies, with no viable escape routes and little hope of making it out alive, they're like rats in a maze, lost, hopeless and running out of room. Ukrainian units, meanwhile, continue to approach the situation with a sense of calmness and control, carefully tracking down their enemies, locating and destroying with precision and purpose. The Ukrainian General Staff recently reported that their forces are making steady progress day by day, recapturing several square miles in the area and consolidating control not just over Volodymyrivka but also Mayak. Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, Alexander Syrskyi, also recently paid a visit to the front lines, confirming in his reports that counter-sabotage and clearance efforts are ongoing in order to rid the area of any remaining Russian reconnaissance groups and isolated units. Syrskyi added that Ukrainian forces will remain active in the area, persisting with a Dobropilya counter-offensive to push the Russian backs to where they came from. But it's the numbers that paint the most damning picture of Russia's abject failure in the Pokrovsk sector. According to recent reports, since August 21, Ukraine has neutralized almost 14,000 Russian soldiers in total. That includes over 8,400 killed, more than 5,400 wounded, and approximately 124 captured. As consolidation efforts in the region persist and Ukraine's drones continue to soar across the skies in search of stragglers and supply vehicles, those numbers are likely to rise even further. Russian commanders initially thought they'd capture Pokrovsk in the early stages of the summer, with Putin himself predicting that all of Donbas would be Russia's before the winter began. Now, however, as summer becomes a distant memory and autumn rains fall across the battlefields of Donetsk, Russia still sits in the same situation as before. Its Donbas campaign is still at a standstill, with Ukrainian drones and artillery enjoying complete control of Pokrovsk and any remaining Russian soldiers simply scrambling to stay alive. Now, learn more about the humiliating way Russia's summer offensive turned out in this video, which explores how and why the Kremlin yet again failed to achieve its aims. Alternatively, check out this video for an in-depth look at how Russia is starting to fall apart from within as rebellions, separatist movements and guerrilla warfare threaten to tear the country to pieces. And finally, make sure you subscribe to our channel too, so you can continue to enjoy informative and up-to-date video breakdowns of all the latest news from the Russia-Ukraine war and other conflicts across the world.